I'll now tell you briefly about today's agenda. First, I will welcome and introduce you to today's speakers. Then, our first speaker, Noreen Muscat, will provide an overview of 21 CFR Part 11 and GAMP 5. She will then continue to discuss the challenges and common pitfalls with software validation. Then, Allan Michaels from Certara will discuss the validation suite for Phoenix WinNonlin, and we will end with a question and answer session. Today's speakers are Noreen Muscat and Allan Michaels. Noreen is a senior quality consultant at QACV Consulting. She has over 18 years of experience in the pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries and has served as a quality system subject matter expert for previous FDA and European Union audits. Allan Michaels is a senior project manager at Certara's Phoenix Technology Services Group. He implements Phoenix and PKF software solutions for customers worldwide. And Allan has more than 15 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. Allan and Noreen, welcome to today's event. Now we'd like to invite our participants on the call to log into Mentimeter. You log into menti.com and use the code 135547. Now that we've told you a little bit about us, we'd like to learn a little bit about you. So our first question for you is, what is your top validation concern? Are you concerned that you might be doing too much or not enough validation of your computer software system? Are you concerned about how and when to use a risk-based approach? Maybe you're most concerned about how you should handle system changes and new releases. So it looks like we've gotten a few folks to respond, and it looks like most of you guys are concerned that maybe you're doing too much or not enough validation. So I'm sure this is something that Noreen can speak to in her presentation. Next, we'd like to know, are you familiar with GAMP? Yes or no? Well, it looks like of the folks that have responded that you are familiar with GAMP. It's great to know. And then our last question is, have you ever validated a SaaS? That's a software as a solution. That's really interesting to know. It looks like some of the folks on this call have experience validating a SaaS, but for some folks on the call, that's something that they're not familiar with. So thanks to everyone for participating in the interactive polling. It's great to get that feedback, and now I'll go back to the slides, and I will hand it over to Noreen to start her section.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending on which part of the country you're at. My name is Noreen Muscat, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about validation and some of the pitfalls and challenges that I've seen a lot of clients and that I've run into myself when I was in the industry. So right now I am doing consulting work, and I do help a lot of clients, both large and small. So I have seen quite a bit of information. So let's talk about a little bit about first, what are the requirements? We all know that FDA requires 21 CFR Part 11. We've all heard of the 21 CFR Part 11 wording, or we've heard it in the acronym in some form within the industry. Validation 21 CFR Part 11 is very specific Code of Federal Regulation. There's talks about not only validation and testing, it talks about protecting your records, record retention, limiting system access, operational system checks, authority checks, personnel qualifications, system documentation, and audit trails. So what does all that mean? The Code of Federal Regulation can sometimes be a little broad. If you read it, it can be interpreted several ways. So what folks did do after 21 CFR Part 11, when it first came out in the mid-90s, folks were doing, in my opinion, way too much validation. So what we had come out of that is GAMP 5. GAMP started with GAMP 1, 2, 3. We're up to GAMP 5 now. GAMP 5 is a risk-based approach to compliant GXP computerized systems. It is the source that all validation folks in the industry look to. Not only is it a resourceful information guide on how to do everything around computer systems, electronic signatures, software development life cycles, it gives you thoughts and guidance on everything around validation. It was produced by a task team that was led by GlaxoSmithKline, and it has also had contributed from the regulatory authorities. That includes the US FDA, the EU MHRA, France, Germany, Japan, Europe. There's a lot of different folks that went into this making. So this is a recognized industry standard that folks are using. Now the good news about GAMP 5 is GAMP 5 allows you to partner with your vendor. Okay? So GAMP 5 talks about lifecycle phases, and this is a quote and a diagram directly out of GAMP 5. It talks about the lifecycle phases of a computer system. So the first phase is concept. Then it moves into the project phase where you're doing your assessments and your impact assessments, coming up with your validation plan, writing your scripts, doing everything that you need to do. Then you're going to release it to operation. During operation, you're going to want to continuously monitor the system and apply any changes, making change control all the way through system retirement. So GAMP 5 talks about all of these different subsections or sub-projects within a life cycle phase. One of the things that most stands out about GAMP 5 from the other GAMPs is that GAMP now allows for leveraging of supplier involvement. What that means is that you can now partner with your supplier and leverage their knowledge, experience, and documentation so that you don't have to do those specific items. So for instance, if you are implementing a SaaS in the cloud, there's going to be some responsibilities that are no longer yours. As long as you have satisfactory looked at your supplier and done an assessment on your supplier, and that can be through a postal audit or any other types of audits, you can now do less validation within the regulated company, which is really good news. So you're going to want to audit your vendors' procedures and software development life cycles, any validation processes they use, and what their data center looks like, of how they retest core functionality, how they back up and restore. You're going to want to go in and look at all their processes. Standardly, most folks do a one-day audit, and they do that audit every 1 to 5 years, depending on the risk of the vendor. And when I mean risk of the vendor, I mean how good are the vendor's quality practices. If they have robust quality practices, you might be able to only revisit their processes once every maybe 2 or 3 years. If they have less robust processes or it's a homegrown system, you would want to audit that vendor at least once a year to make sure that they are keeping up with the quality practices that you would expect them to be using. So some of the when you audit your vendors, some of the quality practices you're going to want to look at. You're going to want to look at their software development lifecycle methodology. What methodology are they using? Are they using standard coding terms? Are they using personnel qualifications? How are they managing their documentation and procedures internally at the vendor? What are their methods for review and approval? You know, they're kind of held to the same standards as a regulated company would be, say, managing their SOPs. So your vendor should have a very robust, strict document control process and how they manage those documents. There should also be design standards, programming standards. There should be some sort of configuration management. How do they manage issues? What are their testing standards and procedures? And how do they separate their development, testing, and production environments that the clients are using? So typical auditing activities that you might want to look at is you want to provide an audit plan and scope, including an agenda. And that sometimes can be all in the agenda if it's a detailed agenda. Then the audit scope, you're going to want to include looking at their quality system, including their training programs, internal audit programs, document management, customer support, and disaster recovery, backup, and restore. Now, most vendors who are in the regulated industry space and sell software to life sciences already are aware of these auditing practices that we have, and they are more than happy to accommodate you if you were to ask to come in for an audit. Now, remember, a lot of folks choose to do a questionnaire or a postal audit, as it's called in GAMP 5. The reason for that is if it's a widely used product within the industry, you can justify in the event of an audit that you did a postal audit because it is widely used in the industry and they go through 50 audits a year, 100 audits a year, or you should be talking to your vendor about how often they're audited by other regulated companies. And that can help you determine what level of auditing you're going to apply to that vendor. So internal validation versus SaaS validation. Internal validation is what we all used to do when we bought software. Everything was implemented on our servers internally. We had to do full functional testing. We had to do IQ, OQ, PQ because there was an install. We had to have server qualification. You had to qualify your infrastructure. So in my opinion, installed validation is a lot more robust and takes a lot longer to adapt to or qualify just because there's so many pieces. Now, when you partner with a good vendor, what happens there is if your vendor has these specific, say, software development life cycles, functional specifications, they're doing installs and system testing, and they have their own SOPs, and you've audited them and you're comfortable that they have robust processes, that means that your validation can be less, meaning you don't have to do full functional testing, full OQ, if your vendor has done it, which is actually a huge time savings on resource and cost. Because doing full functional testing, as you know, clicking on every link and testing every scenario or every drop-down or every piece of information or data that's input or output in the system can take quite a long time. Back in the mid-90s when we used to do validation, we used to do all full functional testing. It took several years to get systems up and running and released to production. I believe without GAMP 5, we were doing too much because the Code of Federal Regulation is very broad. But with GAMP 5, it does narrow that for us. So it does give us justification to audit the vendor, go on with a validation plan. You're going to want to have a configuration spec that's client-specific. So if you are using it out of the box and you haven't changed anything about it, you don't really need a configuration spec. But if you have client-specific properties or you renamed certain buttons or radio buttons or click bars, you want to make sure that you capture those configuration specifications that are specific to you. You're also going to always want to have a user requirement. User requirements are based on your intended business use. User acceptance testing, which is standardly your PQ, you want to wrap it all up with a traceability matrix where you trace your A, your configuration spec, and B, your user acceptance test, user requirements into the test scripts so that you can show where everything was tested. Wrap it all up with a validation summary report, and then you want to go in with your standard operating procedures and quality agreements with your vendors if you need them. So some of the challenges and common pitfalls that we find with software validation, one of the biggest challenges that I found is who is responsible for validating a SaaS. Now, when I was in the industry, I would want to purchase a system. So who's responsible for that system? I know I need IT. I know I need QA in there somewhere because QA needs to sign off on all validation documentation. So who is responsible? Validation is your responsibility. It is not the vendor's responsibility, it is your responsibility. If your vendor does validation, it means you can do less. Some clients even choose to do no validation if they're not changing anything and they're using systems out of box. They just write up a validation plan describing their audit findings and the vendor's procedures. And I've also seen clients do no level of validation outside of a validation plan and a few user acceptance test scripts. You are responsible for system governance. Whether or not your vendor is doing your validation for you, or if you are relying on your vendor's validation documentation, you are still responsible for maintaining that system in a valid state moving forward. So a lot of folks think, oh, we're done with validation, we can release it to production, we're done. You're not done, because if the system makes any changes, it does have to go through change control. You're going to want to write up SOPs, at least a biz system administration SOP that shows what requires change control and what doesn't. Change control might be if you were to change major structure of the system, or if your vendor is applying system releases or new functionality. A lot of folks choose to document that on an impact assessment basis and have a procedure where your day-to-day business processes do not fall under change control. Back in the mid-90s, we used to have everything under change control. So if we wanted to add a property to a new drop-down, we would use change control, which, as you would guess, that actually delays the validation. It delays the use of the system. Folks start using workarounds and they won't use it. So you want to make the system robustly qualified, but you want to make your system administration of that system enough that your business day-to-day operations are not delayed due to change control. Another challenge that folks find out in the industry is that validation is a large burden on my resources. So some of the best practice tips with that is share that responsibility. You want to share that burden. That burden shouldn't fall on one function within your company. A lot of times it falls on IT. The business says, I want to buy this system, validate it for me, and then they go off. It should be a partnership with your vendor, QA, IT, your business owner, and the system administrators who are going to be administering the system moving forward. Those folks tend to be very important when it comes to testing and other features because you want them involved from the beginning so that you have a clear understanding of the intended business use. So the vendor drives the quality of the system. QA reviews and approves the documentation. IT reviews and approves the documentation and sets up the user PC environments. Now, what I mean by that is if the system requires certain plugins to your browser, if it's a web-based system, you would want to make sure that the browsers are compatible with all of your users. You'd want to make sure that other items are checked off on that PC to make sure that the folks are going to actually be able to utilize the system with its full functionality. Business owner is going to author most of the documents, and the administrators. Validation is a large burden on resources, especially internally when you folks all have day jobs. So a lot of best practice tips are utilize your vendor. Your vendor sometimes has validation packages that you can purchase, which might make it easier. If you don't have validation resources at all in-house, if you're a smaller company, look to bring in a validation consultant, somebody who can write all those documents for you and somebody who can modify what the vendor's given you so that it relates to your business use. Okay, another common pitfall and things that I hear about with software validation, validation takes a long time. And this can be true if you're implementing a homegrown system, you're installing it on your servers, you need to qualify your data center, you need to qualify your backup and restore processes, you need to qualify your servers, you need to qualify the install of every application on the servers, which would include your Microsoft Word applications, your Adobe applications. Everything needs to be qualified when it's an in-house validation. So the best way to do validation nowadays is to use a risk-based approach. Now, what I mean by a risk-based approach is you want to look at what parts of the system are the most risky to patient data or safety or other types of items that you would look for, say, in a manufacturing environment. What about the system is going to need the most robust testing? Does your system do analysis? Do you want to make sure that you're inputting some analysis and it's outputting exactly what you would expect it to see, that the reports you run are the data that's in the system? And that could be done with writing some simple scripts and putting that up. So you would want to apply a risk-based approach, you would want to do an internal audit of the vendor to make sure that they have the sufficient processes in place. You want to keep that vendor qualified throughout the life cycle that you own that system. And that would be minimum every 2 to 3 years. The most I've ever seen anybody go is 5 years. 5 years is a long time, and that would only be for vendors that are highly used in the regulated industry. And then vendor audit of their functional requirements should be referenced in your validation plan to justify why you didn't do full IQ/OQ. Now, full IQ/OQ can sometimes still be done even if you audit the vendor, if you find that the vendor's procedures are not in place with what you would expect to see. So that is also part of evaluating the vendor. Before you purchase that software, you want to know that you can partner with that vendor, that that vendor is going to be there with you in the event of an audit to help you through it, that that vendor has the procedures in place and the audits in place, audit procedures in place, so that they can answer all of your questions and they understand your terms. What happens a lot is regulated companies try to implement software that isn't sold only to regulated companies. A lot of software vendors don't understand the full 21 CFR Part 11, e-signature requirements, record retention requirements, all the robustness that it takes to be considered validation in a regulated space. So you want to make sure you look at in your vendors when you're selecting those vendors also. Another common pitfalls with validation is that it's expensive. And yes, it can be. But remember, validation should be a one-time cost when implementing the system. the ongoing process of maintaining the validated state can certainly be done within your internal resources if you write up the correct procedures in your system governance. So one of the best practice tips for testing is it's a major and time-consuming exercise, but it does offer the greatest opportunity for efficiency savings. So you need to verify your user requirements by performing acceptance testing or PQ, but other tests can be identified based on risk, complexity, or novelty. So for example, instead of doing a full functional requirements doc and a full OQ of every click and every feature of your system, you might want to look at some of the features that might be considered high risk and then only do testing in an OQ around those features and not necessarily every other feature that the vendor has already tested. So one of the big takeaways is if you don't have GAMP 5, you need to get it because GAMP really does explain to you how to use the risk-based approach and to make sure that you are qualifying everything enough but not doing too much validation. There is a fine line there, and it is different from company to company that I work with. Some companies choose to still do more. They have the conservative approach. Other companies choose to do nothing. They have the very liberal approach. That approach, sometimes you really need a very strong audit process with your vendor to justify not doing any type of validation when purchasing a system that's part of regulated GXP activities. Or you can come somewhere down in the middle, which is where most folks tend to stay. They do enough that they can satisfy their own internal quality folks, that they've tested the high-risk features of the system, that they've tested the intended business use, any workflows, e-signature requirements, and compliance requirements, and that they don't need to do full OQ functionality testing. Now, there are folks out there who still do full IQ, OQ, PQ, even when it's a software as a service, which to me, there is no IQ because there's no installation. So sometimes you need to adjust to changes within the industry and the thinking of the agencies. So GAMP 5 comes out every 3 to 5 years. Keep up with what GAMP is doing because that's what the industry best practice are tending to do. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about system governance because validation is one thing. Validation can be very costly, but remember, it's only a one-time expense and then it's gone. The system governance is how you're going to regulate that system moving forward. Okay, so once you validate you're not quite done, you need to think about your procedures and the use of change control and system administration and maintenance. And how are you going to manage system releases? Does your vendor release new functionality every month? Is that going to have a big impact on your business? Does the vendor release once or twice a year? You need to look at all of those types of things when writing your system governance documents. You also want to make sure that you include processes so that the end users know their requirements around their e-signatures. So if you've never used e-signatures within your company before and you're going to be implementing them, you do want your users to know that it's just like they're handwritten. So they don't want to give their admins their passwords to electronically signed documents. And you want to make sure in your use and operation that they understand the meaning around their e-signature according to 21 CFR Part 11. You also want to look at system administration procedures and your system change control. Change control within companies are usually quality change control and manufacturing. That can be a very burdensome process, so you might want to look at maybe writing a computer system change control process. So some of the best practice tips for system releases is know your vendor's practices before you buy the system. You know, they should be notifying you at least 30 to 60 days in advance. They should be providing release guides of how to do that. And then the system owner should be reviewing release notes with appropriate users, QA and IT, and then they need to do an impact assessment to make sure that they're testing anything that's being implemented. Is it going to require more training? Is it changing the user interface? You know, you need to look at all of those things with every system release moving forward. So some of the FDA's focus currently is on data integrity. So one of the biggest concerns is shared login accounts for computer systems. Again, you need to train your folks to live in a quality environment, even if they're not part of quality. You shouldn't be sharing your passwords. You wouldn't share your handwritten signature. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the data integrity and the new upcoming guidances to make sure that you are following the standard practices that the FDA or other agencies would expect you to use. Another slide that I'm going to leave you with is another focus that is just the new hot topic in the industry, and that's the General Data Protection Regulation. Now, right now, this is for EU clients, but remember, the EU does it, the FDA is most likely to follow behind. What this means is that you are now responsible for protecting that data. So that means you need to make sure that your vendor is protecting that data that's within that system if it's a system in a SaaS. So again, validation is a very complex process, but it can be made simplified with a few partnerships with your vendor. So now I am going to turn the slides over to Allan, and he's going to talk to you a little bit about the Phoenix 8.1 validation suite.
Thanks, Noreen. So just to introduce myself a little bit, my name is Allan Michaels. I'm a member of the Phoenix Technology Services Group, and I may have worked with some of you on the phone today through some of your validation efforts. But today, my presentation is going to be about the validation suite for Phoenix 8.1. We'll talk about the features of the validation suite and the materials that you'll receive if you decide to purchase the suite. But before we get into looking at the validation suite, I want to reiterate a couple of points that Noreen made through her presentation. These are from GAMP 5, I believe, and just the first point here about regulated companies should seek to maximize supplier involvement throughout the system lifecycle. We have extensive knowledge in putting together these validation suites, and we have information around documentation and the experience that we put into the validation suite. You may be able to leverage that. Of course, it's subject to a satisfactory supplier assessment, AKA an audit, and the second point. And if you have not done an audit of Certara, we have done many audits, and I think we do at least many throughout the year, and you can schedule an audit with our QA department. I think there'll be more information at the end of this call for that. So some examples of how you can use some of the information. You're probably using some of it already through utilizing the Certara support or even Phoenix Technology Services or using the product documentation that comes with Phoenix. So you're probably using some of that already and leveraging some of that knowledge that we've provided to you. But the big question is, how do you make that connection between the vendor's operating environment and yours? Since you'll be installing Phoenix in your own environment, how can you make that connection? In the case of the validation suite and leveraging supplier involvement, the question becomes, how do we make that connection in between the vendor and the operating environment and yours? And we've seen that as part of an audit, if you've had an audit, you've seen that Phoenix was developed in a compliant, regulated way. But now you've got the application in your environment. Now, how do you make that translation between the work that we've done and your work to have confidence in that application? one way to provide that confidence is through the validation suite. Certara's done some extensive validation of the Phoenix modeling engines and calculation algorithms, which I'll show you in a bit, by comparing our results to other reputable software packages such as SAS. So what this means is that we performed our own internal validation activities to ensure that the results generated by Phoenix compare to the results from those other software packages like SAS. Point 2, the validation suite executes Phoenix in your environment and then compares your results to those same internal validation results. So what this means is that the validation suite performs tests in your environment and compares those results to our internal results that we used to validate our validation suite. So you really have a comparison of your results back to the results we've obtained, both through running Phoenix in our environment, but also validation against third-party tools, again, aka SAS. And the last point here, this comprehensive set of tests that we've put together in the validation suite demonstrates that Phoenix is operating in an environment exactly as it was in Certara's environment when we released it, following extensive product testing, thereby providing appropriate confidence in leveraging the validation work we've already done. What I'd like to do now is actually launch Phoenix. So I'm going to share my screen, so give me a second here, and go through some of the validation deliverables that you'll get if you purchase the validation suite. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I've launched Phoenix, and the first thing you're going to notice is that there's a new menu in Phoenix 8.1. It's called Validation. Within this menu, there's a few other items that you can click on. The first menu item is where you can actually execute the suite of tests by clicking on this Start Validation. Now, I'm not going to do that today. Maybe, some of you may be familiar with previous versions of the validation suite where it took up to sometimes 2 days to execute the validation suite. Well, that's not the case with the new one. We've optimized the validation suite to execute within only a few minutes. Now, on my machine, and maybe this is an anomaly, but it ran yesterday within 5 minutes. You may see some differences in your environment, but it's safe to say that within 15 to 20 minutes, you could have all of the tests that the validation suite is supposed to execute completed and passed, hopefully, in your environment and produce a report, a validation report with that. So I'm not going to run that right now, but I'd like to show you some of the documentation you get when you purchase the validation suite. So in this same menu, there's a validation template documents. But within that, before I go into the templates, I want to focus a little bit on this computational engines verification report. So I mentioned that we did all the testing with third-party applications, and what we've done is produce this report, this computational engines verification report. So let's just scroll through the table of contents a little bit, take a look at this. So these are some of the testing that we did internally around the validation suite. So you can see we have all of the NCA models, linear mixed effects models are here. I think bioequivalence, yep. Classic models that you're accustomed to, pharmacodynamic models down here, and Michaelis-Menten models, linear models, and even Phoenix models and descriptive stats. So let's take a closer look at one of the examples here. On page 25, I'm going to focus a little bit on linear mixed effects. And you can see in the first paragraph, it talks about the methods of how we've performed our testing. This shows that we've run the results in SAS-Proc mixed and SAS-Proc GLM where appropriate, and compared those results with Phoenix. And so below, you can see in this table here, you can see that we show the parameter, the WinNonlin result, the SAS results, and the absolute difference and the relative difference. And we do this for all computational engines, so you get this with the purchase of the validation suite. And you can scroll through this document and see all of the tests that we've performed that are associated with the validation suite tests. Okay. So now I just want to focus a little bit on some of these other documents that come with the validation suite. You get a requirements specification, a test plan, traceability matrix, a validation plan, and a validation summary report. Now these are just templates, but there also is some information in two of these documents which I think you'll find very helpful. The requirements specification specifies all the requirements that are going to be met by those tests that are run in the validation suite. The traceability document actually traces the requirements back to those tests that were executed. So those are two very helpful documents if you're, when you have the validation suite, you know exactly what it's testing. These other documents are merely templates. If your organization has templates that you use for your validation, then fine, you don't have to use these. But for other organizations, the smaller organizations that don't have some tests, don't have templates, they can use all of these documents to help them get started on their validation of Phoenix. Okay. The last thing I want to show, which is probably the most interesting, is the validation report that gets created after executing the validation suite tests. So I've executed this yesterday, and I produced this report. This is a PDF document. I think in years past it used to be a Word document, and so now this is a read-only document, so you cannot modify it. The document shows a summary of the environment, number of tests that were run, how long it took to run all these tests. As you can see, in my environment, it took less than 5 minutes. The system environment that I ran it in, and so forth and so on. This next section is about, and this is familiar to those of you that had the validation suite before, with the exception of this, this one column called error messages, where we simply list the test that was executed, the test objective, and whether or not it passed or failed. So this should be relatively familiar. But let me scroll down here to the bottom, where there's a newer section that makes reference back to some of our internal tests that we've performed. So there are three things within here that I think you'd be very interested in, is that these are the tests that we performed with the reference being our test that we performed, the run, which is the results that were coming from in your environment from the validation suite, and the difference between those. These are CSV files, and you can open these simply by clicking on the link and reviewing that information. They are CSV files that once you bring them up, you can edit them, but they are always available from the validation suite in uneditable form. So you don't, so you never lose the fact that when it ran, these are the results that you got, and you can always go back to it in this report. Okay. So as you can see, the validation suite provides a complete set of documentation templates and test results that can leverage Certara's knowledge and experience to show you that this part of the validation, as part of your comprehensive validation effort, was done in a documented and in a very thorough manner. I'm sure you all know that validation is a very complex activity, and Certara is here to help. Our Phoenix Technology Services provide these services to those of you that purchase the validation suite or even other documentation on a services basis to help you complete your Phoenix validation. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand it back over to Suzanne.
Thanks, Allan. We've just got a few more things before we move into our Q&A session. Just want to remind our audience that Certara does provide consulting services to help you validate all your Phoenix products. And if you're interested in that, please do contact Kevin Trim. He's the director of our Phoenix Technology Services Group, kevin.trim@certara.com. And Noreen from QACV Consulting is happy to help our audience members with their comprehensive QA, compliance, and computer validation consulting needs. And you can contact Noreen at noreen.muscat@qacvconsulting.com. So this concludes our presentation. We would like to invite our audience now to submit their questions to Allan and Noreen in the Q&A box. And we look like we've got some questions already. So I take the first one. The question for Allan: does Certara have a solution that provides 21 CFR Part 11 compliance?
Yeah, this is a common question I think that we get from time to time. And Certara's position on this is that we provide the software with the technical controls to implement a 21 CFR Part 11 compliance solution. It's always, as Noreen had pointed out, it's the customer's responsibility to make sure that their system is validated, and we feel as though the software is a piece of that validation, and the vendor, or sorry, the customer really builds around that software solution to build a comprehensive 21 CFR Part 11 compliance system.
Thanks, Allan. Looks like we have a question for Noreen. Can you speak to the difference you might expect in terms of vendor deliverables between a true SaaS environment and a hosted environment?
So a true SaaS environment is going to be a partnership with your vendor. A hosted environment is when you purchase space in a cloud. A hosted environment means that you're just purchasing their hosted space, or you're hosting part of their servers to implement your software. A true SaaS system is implemented on the vendor software, not a third-party software. It's not implemented on a third-party server. It is implemented within and managed within-house at the vendor. A hosted system sometimes can be placed on a third-party vendor, and then you get into more complications where you have to qualify those third-party vendors that are hosting that system.
Thanks, Noreen. Someone in our audience wanted to know when Phoenix 8.1 would be available, and I can answer that. The answer is that'll be available for download on June 18th. Allan, it looks like we have another question for you. When do you have to use validated software in drug development, and what happens if you don't use validated software?
Well, any system used to generate results submitted to an agency should be using a validated system. If you don't use a validated system, then you'll probably have to explain that to the agency. That's what I've seen in the past, is that you have to provide some set of documentation or explanation as to why you didn't validate the system.
I would also like to add to that, Allan, if I could.
Sure.
I have seen warning letters issued for data that was recalled because the system was not validated. If you're using data to submit to an agency, or you're getting information from clinical trials or other types of manufacturing events, you want to make sure that those systems are validated. If they're not, that data can be dismissed, meaning that it's not useful to the FDA and they're not going to use it, which could in turn affect your product in the long run. Because if you have data that's showing positive results or you met your endpoints, but that data wasn't captured in a validated environment or regulated, then you could end up not getting your product to market. So it is something very important to think about.
So one of our attendees did ask Allan if he can show how the Val Suite runs, and Allan has graciously agreed to show that. So Allan, I'm going to pass that on over to you to show that, to show our audience.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, so this could take about 5 minutes to run, but I did go through the menu item here to start validation, but I just didn't click the button to start. So I'm going to click that I'm going to validate the WinNonlin application. Click Start Validation. You'll see a window pop up here on the left-hand side. That's showed on another screen, I'm sorry. Let me pull it back over here. So now it's thinking about executing the tests. And you can see Phoenix in the background is loading some of these tests, executing these tests, and verifying the reference meets the Phoenix result and giving it a disposition of failed or passed. So let's take a few more minutes if you, I don't know if you want to take a question or two while this is running.
Sure, we can do that. Looks like there's a question for Noreen. We're a small pharma company. Can it be expected that we don't have to do a vendor audit because we know that the same system is purchased by large pharma companies that probably will do a full validation check?
So yes, I have seen clients take that methodology, but again, you would have to justify that within your validation plan as to why you're not doing this or you're not doing that. It's very important that you document. FDA stance is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So I would at minimum send a questionnaire if possible. If you really feel strongly that your vendor is highly qualified, then I would just put that justification into your validation plan.
Thanks, Noreen. Someone had a question for Allan. Can you run other applications while the Val Suite is running?
Yes, you can, and I can do just about anything I want. I think I can even minimize, well, I can't minimize the window, but I can come over and pull other documents over top of it and do other work. It will be unaffected, or the validation suite will be unaffected by that work. So yes, you can.
Okay, great. See, it looks like we have a question for Noreen. Allan, I guess it's still running, but it looks like it's going to be done in just a minute.
Yep, we've got about halfway through.
Okay, perfect. Can you, Noreen, can you provide an example of the risk-based approach when it comes to testing?
So you would want to make sure that you have the risk-based approach methodology used. It explains it in GAMP 5. It's a very good explanation. But what you would want to look at is you would want to look at the functionality of the system and decide which parts of the system are high risk. So sometimes reports would be high risk because you're outputting data that might be used in a clinical trial, a manufacturer, or a regulatory submission. So you might want to consider report output high risk. You might want to consider if the system's doing any analysis, such as a SAS system or the Phoenix system. If it's doing analysis, you would want to make sure that the analysis is correct from the input to the output. So you would want to make sure that you're looking at the system and testing at least the high-risk functions that could pertain to patient safety or data.
Thanks, Noreen. Allan, you have time to answer one more question while this is finishing up running?
Sure, I've got 20 more tests to run. Go ahead. Okay.
Do you have to validate Phoenix if it's installed in a shared environment like Citrix?
Yeah, I've worked with many customers on this, and there is a validation effort for even installing Phoenix on a shared environment like Citrix. So, you know, it's a good common way to use Citrix to allow multiple users to access the system, and it's a good strategy to minimize your validation efforts. So, and change controls as well. So yes, the answer is yes, you should be validating on a shared environment. 7 more tests.
Noreen, someone would like to know if you have any suggestions on what to do if your vendor changes their system and as a result, a mandatory user requirement is changed or deleted from the software or new functionality is added.
So what you would do in that case is you would put it through change control. You would look at what is changing. You would decide if it's going to change your user requirement or your validation documents. Do you need to do additional testing around that functionality? Is it a big enough change? You know, if it's a text box that went from 50 characters to 200, that might not be a huge change that requires a lot of testing. But if it's something of a new report that's output with data from within the system, you might want to do a little more robust testing on that. You would also want to make sure you're updating your validation documents, any user requirement specs, any SOPs that process might be around, and deciding whether or not during your change plan if you need to retrain anybody on the new functionality.
Thanks, Noreen. Allan, it looks like the validation just finished up. That really was fast.
Yeah, it is finished. Can you still see my screen?
Yeah, let me give you back the ball. You can share it.
Okay, just to finish this up. Okay, so you can see, oh, let me go back here. All right. Okay, you can see I've got a message here that the validation was complete, right? And I can just click on OK with that. Now what it's going to do is generate the report that I talked about and we reviewed earlier. We'll give that a second. And I just close this. And so now if I go back to the validation menu, I'll see another report from what we just ran. And I can look at that report and look at the results here. We ran the 83 tests. It took about the same amount of time as yesterday. About 5 minutes. All of the tests have passed when comparing them to the references. So it looks like we're finished.